All right, welcome back to the last module of the fall semester. And we're going to be moving on from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, which is a really interesting and fun time period to kind of cover. Now, Renaissance means rebirth, and what we're really talking about here is a period of innovation in culture and art and learning that took place from really the 1400s to the 1700s. And really the first half of that is the part where we're really going to kind of be truly concerned with in the next couple video lectures. Now, this starts in Italy and spreads to other parts of Europe, and there are a number of famous artists that go along with this, like Leonardo da Vinci, Donatello, Michelangelo, all the other Ninja Turtles, of course. And the Renaissance is also very famous for its part that it played in learning. And I think that it's really the most important thing going on here. But I also want to be careful. I think we need to caution you about these terms to some extent. I think that some of what is implied with this idea of rebirth is, oh yeah, we're leaving the Middle Ages behind, and let's get back, to Greco-Roman era, and we're going to drag the human beings, kicking and screaming out of the Middle Ages. But even though the term implies that there is, a great jump between these two things, I think that that's sort of an old view and really a false view where, the Renaissance is a time of great achievement, but I don't want it to be just that. The Renaissance, is an achievement, but to say that nothing good happens in the Middle Ages is, which is sometimes how it's presented, I think that it's, not exactly true. And I think that, most of the prestigious universities in the world today have their origins in the high to late Middle Ages. And we have talked about some of those achievements. And I don't think that they come at the expense of the medieval era. I think that we kind of look at the medieval age in a bad light. Though art, now when we get to the Renaissance, the art certainly improves, and I think that there's a combination of both ancient ideas that they're returning to, and that's what the rebirth is really about. Also, combining it with the best of the medieval ideas, and I think that that's the part that completely gets neglected in a way that it's presented and the way it's taught. Perhaps if you had learned about the Renaissance in the past, I'm sure you know about the achievements in art and learning, but it certainly is not meant to dismiss the thousands of years that came before where really humans had done quite a bit of achievement in the past as well. And I think it's a bit unfortunate that that's sometimes how it gets framed. So the Renaissance is really a renewed interest in several things, human beings and their conditions. Now in the next lecture, I'm going to get more into the human condition called humanism. And that's going to be, again, in the second part of this lecture. So hold on to that. But it's also an interest in education and art and literature and science. And we're going to talk about, again, the dates here. It's really the end of the 1300s through the early 1600s, so the 14th through 17th centuries, like I mentioned. And that gets right up. It's also to where the Reformation takes place, which is what the third lecture in this module is going to be about. And so it's a little bit tricky because we're going to introduce some things that happened before, but another major event that's happening with it, the Renaissance, is the Reformation. So you kind of have to go back and forth a little bit, but don't get confused that these two things are kind of tied together in a way. Now, the Renaissance started in Italy, where wealth from trade supported the art and learning, and it's very simple. The prosperity that northern Italian states like Venice and Florence were enjoying led to an increased sponsorship of the arts. They did not face major ongoing wars like the 100 Years' War of France. They don't have to worry about all of that. It was hit by the plague, but no more so than any other region in Europe. And so they're actually able to kind of recover faster because they weren't subject to these terrible wars. Italian cities found it easy to cooperate with the Pope, so there's a whole, scheme of power that we talked about in the Middle Ages, that the northern Italian cities have a bit easier time with the Pope because they're kind of used to it. It's a fully Catholic region at this point, and they weren't really bothered by other Europeans because they don't really want to anger the Pope also. So they have some of these nice advantages built in, and they are merchant cities. Venice, Florence, Genoa, were actually kind of dominating the commerce of the region. And here is, where modern capitalism is born. It's kind of born to private individuals and companies and not the government owning businesses. They're bringing in lucrative trade from the Arabic world in terms of spices and tea and other commodities coming from the East and through the Arab world, and then into Italy before being dispersed into Europe. And these are big business. And one of the things of the medieval era that I'm glad is not the case anymore is that the food was probably pretty bland. Because, the medieval food, they didn't have access to the East, and now you do. And so at this point, with the increase in spice trade, it's a really big deal. And I imagine being able to, now flavor the foods hundreds of different ways. And before, all you could do is just really eat a potato. And, I imagine now you can cook, you've got things in your spice rack. And, the cities are going to profit immensely off of these things. So much so that they actually become Republican-style governments that are led by merchant councils. And they represent the people, and the citizens participate. And they're not typically led by a king. And so this is another major change from the medieval era, and the wealth that is flowing in is a really big part of that. So Florence, Venice, Genoa, these are the big three. They're trading centers. They distribute goods all over the place. And again, these republics are kind of governed by the merchants. And just to point out that they are, where they are, here's Genoa. Where are we at? Right here. We have Venice, right? We have Florence. And again, trade's coming over here and up, and they'll take it to Germany and go to France and all throughout Europe. And it's very much the hub of commerce there. And there's just an increased demand. As soon as people realize that what they can do with these spices and these foreign goods, they're going to buy them like crazy. And this leads to another really important thing, like the use of credit to make a purchase. Major purchases were basically, modernish banking-like loans with a paper trail showing who's taking money and where the credit is being coming from, and it's expanding the money supply and speeding up trade. And again, this is the root of our economic system. Not saying that our system is perfect, but it has our roots here several centuries ago during the Renaissance. And you can trace some of these roots too. And though we have major issues with debt in this country today, and there's a lot of controversy about what should be done about student loan debt, and you have to understand the idea behind this is by and large a good one when everything works, which is to say, if I start a business and I don't have the money to start a business, I can borrow it to start the business. And if my business works, I'll have plenty of money to pay the bank back, and they'll get some money on top of that in the form of interest, and then they'll have more money to lend to the next guy. And if it doesn't work, I don't pay them back, the whole thing kind of falls apart like during the Great Depression. But when this works, it allows for more business to develop, more trade to take place, it expands the economy. That's why people do it. And all of this is made possible by Arabic numerals, right? Imagine looking at a credit card statement today in Roman numerals, or imagine looking at your bank account and say, 22 or 25, and you look at it and you're like, XXV, and it would be very difficult to do everything in Roman numerals, but the Arabic numerals really help with this. The Arabic people made math much easier to teach, and now you get these new banks and new accountants and accounting practices that make it a lot easier for everyone to basically understand. And of course, it's going to grow as a system. So the economic foundation, I think, is pretty clear and very, very important. Again, trade ties the Middle East and these cities as a hub, and then the capitalist practices that we've talked about. Now, let's talk about a little bit more about the art for this lecture, and we'll switch over to humanism for the next lecture. With the Renaissance, there's really these groups that are really important thinkers, and there's groups that are important artists, and we'll hit some of the thinkers, but first the artists. Because I think the most iconic aspect of the Renaissance, the tremendous artistic achievements, it's kind of fixing and curing us, from the medieval stench that we had, this idea that, people were stupid in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. And I think that we can basically flatly reject that. There were some terrible things that happened, but there were some great achievements in universities as well. And so we kind of quibble with that idea. But I think that Renaissance education actually builds on some of the medieval practices. But Renaissance art, I got to admit, that's a pretty huge leap forward. I mean, we have things like the Mona Lisa, the Statue of David, things that are totally incalculably valuable, right? It's another one of these things like that we've talked about that reminds me of, these auctions where, if this was ever up on the auction block, you couldn't even afford it because it's worth billions of dollars. Some of these priceless artifacts from this time frame. And we'll begin with Leonardo, because I think Leonardo is a quintessential perfect example of a Renaissance man. It really means that you're brilliant in multiple fields being a Renaissance man. And we don't do this too much anymore. Usually we've kind of specialized, but Da Vinci was an artist. You might think of him as a scientist, an architect, an engineer, a coroner, and he's pretty famous for his paintings, and they are sought after, for sure. He also had great engineering skills. He oversaw the construction of things like the naval defenses of Venice, the swamp drainage projects in Rome. He paints the Mona Lisa. I mean, who does all this? He's a genius for sure, the Renaissance man personified. He's hired by a whole swath of rich and powerful people living in France and Italy, and he's the official painter for the French king. He lived in a private chateau, which was provided for him. He received visitors who admired his work. This guy is, very famous in his own day, but I think he's got an even bigger legacy today than he did then, probably because of his science, and his scientific work is very closely related to his artistic work. And, that's incredible. And so Leonardo's art would come in handy for a lot of his science as well, because he's very good artistically. He can make precise sketches of things that he's talking about. For example, he examines the bodies of executed criminals, tries to learn about the human body. He's basically able to sketch things like the Vitruvian Man down below on the right. He figures out, the anatomy really is what, he figures out what he's doing with the anatomy. And there's nothing new about autopsies, right? There's doctors in the Middle East and North Africa and Europe had been doing autopsies to further medical knowledge for centuries. And that's part of the basis of medical knowledge, but he's able to document them with meticulous detail thanks to his artistic talent. And it kind of gives him a leg up. And so he also creates a very interesting diagrams of things like flying machines, like you can see on the right, and more practical things like hydraulic engines and weapons. And the flying machines are really fantasy-based, unlike he tries to do them like on, the basis of the anatomy of birds and stuff like that. And they don't really work. But Leonardo does everything. And remember, thanks to his diagrams, like the ones that you see here in the Mona Lisa, he's also very practical as an engineer, which is, like I said, the naval defenses, the swamp drainage. And this is a guy who understood the world in a very, very profound way and did more than just art. He's also famous for his painting of the Last Supper, which is an iconic painting. You can see it all over the place. And again, totally priceless piece of art. Next person we're going to talk about is Michelangelo, who would actually be the most celebrated artist in the Renaissance during his own lifetime. The City Council of Florence, which was run by the Medici family and the popes, both, like there was a main government and a main religious authority, and they would hire Michelangelo. He created numerous works, the most famous being the Statue of David and painting the Sistine Chapel. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel took him forever, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, if you look at this sculpture here, because I think there's one thing you can say, okay, the Renaissance is really a huge leap forward. Here we have the Pieta, which is a scene of the Virgin Mary holding the dead body of Christ before he is resurrected. And we have the medieval version on the left, and we have Michelangelo's version on the right. So obviously, the one on the left, that's done during the medieval time, and Michelangelo is during the Renaissance. And you can see the change in this humongous leap forward of attention to detail and stuff like that, and going back to the artistic quality of the Greco-Roman era. And this kind of shows a clear example of that. Now, the Sistine Chapel took him 4 years, during which he constantly argued with the Pope, Julius II, who treated him like an artisan servant rather than a master. And his artistic genius was really, not recognized by the Pope. And stuff like the Statue of David and his other sculptures, he was already the most famous artist in Europe, and he was not being treated as such. And so he's going to wrestle, and he bristles so much to the point that he actually even depicts the Pope being dragged into hell by the demons, kind of at the bottom corner of this. And that's his way, his kind of sassy way of getting back at the Pope. And it's a very beautiful building. I have actually been there, and it's really breathtaking to go and see. But you can look at lots of pictures of this on Google and stuff like that. The Sistine Chapel, basically the roof is a record of the Bible, of the early church history, and there's lots of these beautiful scenes. And the kind of beginning of this whole thing was, the slide with God creating Adam, and he goes and he just kind of goes through these iconic scenes throughout the Bible. It's an absolute masterpiece, and it's a very tiny church, but thanks to Michelangelo's work, it's of course world famous today. Next, we're going to talk about Machiavelli. You're going to be reading a little bit of his work, a section of his work here. He represents the sort of change in the way people think as he writes about how to rule and how a ruler should do anything they can to maintain power. Therefore, the end, and he would say the ends justify the means. And that expression gets used a lot today. And it really kind of comes back to Machiavelli's work, The Prince. And if possible, he says you should be a good ruler, but do evil when necessary, because if you keep power, then it's worth it, and the end justifies the mean. Now, what Machiavelli represents is a shift in the way people think about how rulers get, acquire, and justify their use of power. Through the divine right, though the divine right is still going to be with us for a long time, it's sort of another topic that we kind of talk about in semester 2. Even Machiavelli looks at it as from a sort of practical standpoint and basically says power is the height of rule. And you can do everything to attain power and keep it, and this is basically a new way of looking at politics and political theory. An effective ruler should train constantly in war, should force his subjects to fear but not hate him. It's better to be feared than loved, because most men will operate in the right way towards you. If they fear you, if they love you, you're rolling a dice. And the idea here, he also kind of believes studying ancient past for role models like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar. And he says, don't waste a moment worrying about mortality when power's on the line. And so perhaps he abandons the moralistic approach more so. And however, there should be, something to be said about that. And he doesn't, kind of stay in line with the good Christian ideas, and he embraces a, kind of more practical guide to keeping and maintaining power for good. And those are the ideas he puts forward. The Prince caused quite a scandal when it came out for completely ignoring the role of God and Christian morality in politics and, the divine right of kings. And that was a very, important view back then. And it's still, his ideas are very popular today. And it's a radical shift in thinking about these things. All right. And so in the next section, we're going to talk about humanism, but we're going to call this one good for now. Thanks.